All right. Hello, everyone. Wait just a minute for a couple folks to join. See how this goes. Maybe I should just let the jam roll for just a moment here. Get some people coming in. Hi. Thanks for stopping by. Great to see everybody. Thanks for coming, and we will light this candle and get things started. So hi, my name is Eric. I'm also known as Apuk online, and today I'd like to talk to you about improving the audio quality on your stream. I'm a synthesist, obviously, and a shrimp streamer. Also, shout out to my Doom Fam crew, who is the primary people that I do raid trains with. And I'm also a live sound engineer here in Portland, Oregon, and spend a lot of time behind a mixing desk working on live audio for bands. And so I feel like I can bring a perspective into the streaming world that hopefully will help people sound better on stream, which is always a good thing. Today we're going to talk about three main concepts: gain staging, mixing, and compression. And we'll start off with gain staging. Gain staging is just kind of a fancy name for getting things as loud as possible, but not too loud. Gain in audio terminology means volume, or more accurately, the strength of an audio signal. And staging means making sure that every part of the audio chain, from the source that's generating the audio to the thing that's transmitting that to the listener, sits correctly with the things that come before it. What happens if it's wrong? Now, I may have probably heard this in the outside world, where if you have too little gain, as if you're trying to listen to something that is a source that's too quiet, you have to turn up the volume really loud, and that introduces hiss and unwanted noise, because there's a certain amount of inherent electrical noise in the system, in any kind of amplified system. And if you turn up a quiet signal really loud, you're increasing that noise floor along with the signal that you actually want to hear. Conversely, if there's a signal that's too loud, and you've probably heard this as well, where it will introduce what's called clipping, which is where the signal has too much level, has too much voltage going through a particular part of the component chain, and that introduces unwanted effects like harsh digital noise if it's a digital stage, or in some cases it can be desirable, like rock and roll guitar started off as a deliberately overloaded gain stage in an amplifier, and once you've got that magical saturated tube tone, though, you don't want to further overload it, especially when it moves into the digital world. As I said, this comes into unpleasant, harsh tones, audio waves that get squared off because they've exceeded the level that the signal path can handle, and it sounds really unpleasant. It can just sound like digital static in extreme cases. So how do you get it right? In a word, unity. Unity gain is the audio terminology for the ideal level of input to a stage. Stage is everything from anything that can increase or reduce the level of a system, or a level of a signal as it goes through the system. And the goal is, all things being equal, every stage of every element of the mix is running right around at unity gain. And then the final output levels that go out to the listener, whether that's the PA at a venue or the encoding software that's sending your stream up to Twitch, becomes an artistic choice rather than a technical one. So you can, reduce the level of instrument in order to send it more to the background. We'll talk about that in a minute, or bring the level up overall to make a moment of impact for your listeners. But it moves out of the technical realm of making sure that things work together, and it's one of how do we want this to sound? How do we make an artistic choice about this? So in general, this is the process of adjusting the output level of each part of the signal chain as it moves into the next one. And what does that mean in practice? I'll shift over and show you. So over to the side here on this camera, I've got my mixer, has a bunch of inputs running into it. This is what I use for streaming. And pretty much every system, the controls are going to differ depending on whether you have a software interface or a hardware mixer like this one, digital console, but they all follow the same principles. There's a volume level from whatever it is that's generating the source, and that plugs into an input channel on an interface or onto the mixer. That input channel then has a gain level, and this is sort of the first point at which you have to worry about gain staging. The connection between the sound source and the next thing upstream of it has to be matched up well, and in order to not, again, either be too quiet and introduce noise floor, and not to be too loud and to clip the signal. So I'm going to gradually increase the volume level on my synthesizer, and we'll see the level first be too quiet and we won't be able to hear it, and then too loud, and it will cause these peak lights, which are in this case are physical lights. In some cases, if you're using software, you'll see the metering levels turn from green to red. In some cases, you usually get a visual indication of when things are way too loud. Here we go. So you can see there that even though this is not a particularly harsh set of signals, pretty soft synth pad, but I was able to, by turning that gain pot all the way up, cause both the peak light to hit as on the mixer, as well as some unpleasant audio artifacts to come through. And what I did was I turned it up to the point at which it generated that bad tone, and we saw the peak light kick on, and then backed it off a bit. And in general, we want each of the levels in our gain staging to have a little bit of room to move up and a little bit of room to move down. So we don't want everything to be completely maxed out. If so, you might have a more fundamental mismatch in the signal level. Like if your sound source is just simply not producing enough signal, and you have to turn that gain knob all the way up in order to hear anything, probably want to troubleshoot that a little further and make sure you're sending the right kind of a signal, whether it's set to a line versus a mic or something like that. But we want to leave a little bit of headroom in order to turn up, and then back off a little bit so that we're not running in the red the whole time. And normally that means, like, if you have a dial that goes from 0 to 10, keep it about 8. And in many cases, the unity level, I'm not sure if you can see it on stream, but the level that's 0 is usually unity, and that is often labeled for these pots, which go from the kind of a 7 o'clock to 5 o'clock on a clock dial. That unity point is going to be about at 2 o'clock. And that's pretty much where this one ended up. And so that sounds pretty good. The next stage is when that goes from the mixer into the next thing that's downstream of it. In this case, I'm running everything into Ableton Live, and there's an additional level of gain that we can see there. I'm not going to get into that at this moment, just in the interest of time, but just be aware that like for each one of those points in your signal chain, again, from the sound source all the way out to the point at which it exits, either out into speakers or out into the digital realm through OBS or whatnot, that there's an opportunity to get that gain right and an opportunity to get it wrong. And it really is a question of making sure that things are not too hot and not too cold. All right, I'm going to move on to mixing. So once you've gotten each of those elements right individually, the next thing to think about is how they all fit together. And there's a really nice analogy from this, from a book that's available at makingmusic.ableton.com by Dennis DeSantis, where he makes an analogy to a painting where there's a foreground, a middle ground, and a background in the painting. And it's important to think about how each of the sonic elements that you're building fit into this kind of landscape that you're painting. That's the overall picture of the sound that you want to deliver. And in some cases, that can be a question of volume. That is, things that are louder in the mix we tend to perceive as being more in the foreground. In some cases, a question of timbre or tone, where things which are have more overtones to them, that have a harsher timbre or more full timbre, we also perceive those as being in the foreground. Whereas sounds that are softer, or even if they're loud, if they're muted in a from a timbre standpoint, they'll also be perceived as being in the background. And this is a thing to think about, not just for initially setting up the mix, but also for introducing variance and interest into the compositions as you're building them, which is that things can move, and a single element can move from the foreground to the background, and taking something which was previously in the background and kind of hanging out there as a quiet or a muted tone and soloing that out. For example, removing the rest of the instruments around it, all of a sudden now that's the only thing, and therefore it comes to the foreground and can be more interesting that way. There's a couple of so in addition to just getting the overall levels right, a huge tool in the toolbox for mixing is the equalizer. And almost get similar to a gain stage, almost every element in the signal chain has the opportunity to do some equalization. It's important to be judicious about it. And here's just a couple of tips that I've come across. And I have a huge shout out here to a fellow audio engineer here in Portland, Dave Clark, who was the touring engineer for a number of years for metal bands like Neurosis, but also is a super, super great human being, and has a technique that I have adopted myself when I'm sound checking bands, or also when I'm doing things on stream, which is to take an element that you're not sure about but is not quite sitting right for you artistically and make it worse. Take, if you're hearing like a frequency that doesn't fit in, to isolate where that frequency is, take your equalizer and sweep if you have a parametric EQ, that is where the frequency can change as well as the gain at that frequency. Sweep it until you find the negative sounding pieces, and then accentuate them to make sure you've actually dialed in the part that's causing the problem. And then you can pull it down and bring it back into the negative. But that way you know that you've correctly identified the thing which you've intuited is not sounding right. You've made it worse just for a moment. You don't want to leave it there and alienate everyone and make them hate you, but just for a moment to make it worse, and then notch it out, and then you will have fixed the problem that you've identified. Related to that is the idea that taking things out with an EQ is better than adding them back in. That is, it's nearly always better on an EQ. They do have both a plus and a minus side on an equalizer, but it's pretty much always better to remove them than it is to add new things in. This is particularly important when we're talking about compression later on, but in general, if you have two elements in the mix, going back to that foreground and middle ground and background analogy, if you have two things in the mix which are conflicting for space in the foreground or in the middle ground, it's a better choice to take out one or the other of them, and to either notch that out, reduce its volume, in some way make space in that mix, instead of boosting it up and trying to clobber the conflicting element, because then you will have just introduced more sonic energy and more noise, more level across the overall mix, and that can make things sound muddied or harsh or painful in the worst case for the listener. And so removing things is generally better than adding that back in. And lastly, I would say that EQ should be used as a scalpel rather than a battle axe. And by this, I mean that you want to be judicious about how you're EQing. Sometimes I'll come up to a mixing desk in a live situation and see that there's 12 different bands of EQ that have all been manipulated in various ways, either boosted or cut. And I have to think at that point that there's a deeper problem that's going on either in the PA or in the source instruments or somewhere along the signal chain that's causing all of these cuts and boosts to be necessary, because most things are generally pretty okay, and unless we're doing really extreme effects things from an artistic standpoint, that things should stay pretty flat, and you just want to make judicious scalpel-like cuts rather than try to cut out huge swaths of it. One exception to that guideline, though, I would say is for low end, and we'll talk about that more in just a moment when we get into compression. But low end can get below 150 hertz or so. It can get muddy real quick, and if there are synthesizer tones, for example, that may introduce low frequency information, but are not intended. You don't intend them to be part of the bass line or part of the bass of the track that you're making. It can be a good idea to just cut that out with a high pass filter and remove the low end information from that signal source completely, so that it doesn't bleed over inadvertently. And for example, when we talk about side chaining, it doesn't accidentally cause your side chain to kick when you don't intend it to. Perhaps that's a segue into the next section. We'll talk now about compression. This is probably one of the most commonly talked about subjects in audio engineering, especially if you go off of the number of YouTube videos. It's a ton of YouTube information, a ton of things about compression. I'm not going to go into every single thing about it because there's just too much. There's a great introduction to compression from mastering.com, which is where I got this graphic from. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of applications of it, particularly as they apply to streaming. So one of them is, we'll talk about end of chain compression, mix glue, and we'll talk about side chaining. Yeah, Loop, I hear you. I've been using compression for years and still don't understand it. I think some of that is because people talk about it too much, or it's been touted as this mystical way to fix everything with your mix, and it's not that. At the heart of it, compression is just the idea that there's a element in the signal chain which responds to incoming signal and reduces the output signal based on certain characteristics of the input signal. It compresses it or reduces it. Now, there's more to it than that, and there's different applications, but at its heart, it's like we're taking something that comes in and making less of it to go out. The a key aspect of that is the ratio, as you can see here, and we'll talk about that in a minute, which is like 3:1. 3 decibels of increase in input signal only results in 1 dB in output signal. But as a practical matter, what that means for streaming is that so first we'll talk about end of chain compression. For end of chain compression, this is, by end of chain, I mean the very last thing before your signal hits the internet when we're talking about streaming online. And ideally, this is really the very last thing before your, the very last point at which you're doing signal processing before you go into your streaming software. In my case, I'm going to shift over here into share my screen instead of the synth stuff. I have Ableton running. And my setup is currently such that I have all of the, let's see, put it up here. All of the stuff that you saw in the mixer runs into Ableton Live. Ableton has some very low-key stuff running, and it's mostly just a way to get this end of chain compression because Ableton then sends directly through a virtual interface into OBS. And what I have for my end of chain compression is Ozone, which is, I got it for free. This is Ozone 9 Elements, and it has a bunch of things on it, but you can see in the last bit is a compressor. This just takes everything that's coming in, it's responding to my voice now, and brings it up to a target level. This has two nice effects. The first one is that if you accidentally have something that is loud, like if I bring in a new synth or a drum hit that is excessively loud, it's not going to cause that clipping, that harsh digital noise that we heard earlier to go out onto the stream. It'll respond to that, squash it down, and keep the output level tamed before it hits the output. And the second thing I mentioned a minute ago is mix glue. Glue means that the disparate elements of your mix have the same setting compressions applied to them before they head out to the internet, and so they feel a little bit more cohesive. The settings on this one, the Ozone is nice because it will automatically learn the threshold and it will sort of fix things for you. Again, I'm not going to get super into this, but I will say that it's very, very beneficial to have something that is running at the last stage of your mix before it goes out onto OBS or onto the stream. So that's end of chain, and that's mix glue. The settings there, again, they'll vary, but I suggest you target about a 2.5 to 1 ratio on that one. That means that 2.5 dB of input will only result in 1 dB of output gain, and we can tweak it from there. We can talk further, answer questions afterwards, but yeah, that's a pretty good thing for your end of chain stuff. Move on to side chaining here. Side chaining is a specialized application of compression. So normally, as we saw when Ozone was running, you compress based on the input signal, and when that input signal exceeds the threshold that you've set in the settings, then the compression kicks in according to its settings. Side chaining means that you use a different signal. And this is the name comes from when we had hardware devices. People still use these, but it literally would be plugged into the side of the device instead of the input. So your signal that you're using to trigger that threshold and determine whether the threshold is exceeded is not the signal that you're listening to that's passing through the compressor, but it's something that's plugged into the side of it. We have a software equivalent of that here, so that way, even if the normal input signal is below the threshold, when the sidechain source goes above the threshold, that main signal will be affected. Well, the first question is, why is this desirable? Why would you ever want this? The effect of it, the audio effect of it, is that it makes the rest of the mix go away for a moment when that sidechain source is active. This leads to the other common name that you frequently hear sidechaining called, which is ducking, because causes the rest of the mix to sort of duck away or to move away from that input signal. And this is a huge part of a lot of genres. So the example that I'm going to use here is dub techno, but the same technique is found in house music, hip hop, especially brain feeder artists like Flying Lotus and Teebs. Teebs basically built their entire sound on the feeling of a sidechain electro, EDM, anything where there's a strong beat as a foundation to the sound can benefit. But it's possible to overuse it, just like we saw earlier with levels, and so it's important to figure out how to do it right. In this case, I'm using just the built-in Ableton compressor, and I'm going to start unmuting some elements from the play that I'm running here, and we'll hear that come in. I'll bring back the synth that we heard earlier. And I have a little kick going, and the settings here are set up to, as you can see, the sidechain turned on, and it's set to sidechain from the play. An interesting thing here is that the source signal doesn't have to be audible in order for this sidechain to work. I have a filter set up so that it will only respond to the signal below 120 hertz. That's important because we don't want to like pick up other elements. We really just want that kick to come through nice and strong. And the kick is not audible, but it's still being sent to the sidechain, which lends to a nice pulsating effect here. As I said, you can have too much of it, and I'll show you what that looks like. If I turn up the release, that is and this is sort of like on an ADSR envelope. You can, there's an attack for how quickly it takes effect, and then a release for how slow it is, fast or slow it is to go away. If I take that release and make it longer than the pace or the rate at which the kicks are coming in, the compressor never has time to uncompress, and therefore the effect is lessened, and it starts to sound a little muddy. What that sounds like. Bring that release back down so that it's below the level, and now you get a much more pronounced effect. And if I bring that back in, along with maybe clap, that sounds pretty nice. Bring in another couple elements here. Thing about the Ableton mini compressors will have the same characteristic, but the nice thing about the Ableton one is that you can listen to just the sidechain signal, so that helps you dial in the filter and make sure that I'm not picking up things that I don't want to hear. Yeah, sorry about that. Yeah, the mic muted for a sec when I turned that. We were just auditioning the sidechain signal, excluding my mic. Cool. Well, I'm happy to take some Q&A if we've got questions in the chat. I'm going to move back over to the mixer and get Ableton out of the way. Actually, I'll bring up Ozone here so that we can see what's going on at that end of chain compression, because I kind of glossed over that for a minute. There wasn't any audio running through it, so it didn't sound like anything. But you can see here that great, thanks Beta. We'll bump over there in just a sec. You can see here that as the signals start to come in, we'll see compression be applied. In this case, if it's below the target level, it'll get boosted up, and if it's above, we'll again compress that and bring it back down. But in both cases, it makes the overall changes, the dynamics, smooth out a little bit. You can see on the left-hand side, which is the input side here, that when I make a plosive or a loud sound on the mic, that the input spikes a little bit, but the output does not. And again, that's compression working to protect the output levels and to make sure that some rough, unexpected noise doesn't make it through and cause clipping on the output side. Loop Hazard asks, the threshold is that the target level we want the mix to say? The threshold is the input, the level of the input signal at which compression starts being applied. Yeah, so on the built-in one, you can see that a little more clearly. All right. Well, I think that's the end for me. Thanks so much for joining. Hope this is helpful. Again, my name's Eric. I'm Mapook on Twitch. Throw me a follow, and look forward to chatting more with y'all.